as everybody that you speak to in this government acknowledges, this is not a Prime Minister with a strong sense of what he's trying to do or why he's trying to do it.
Hello and welcome to Coffee House Shots. I'm James Heale and I'm joined today by Michael Gove and Tim Shipman. Now this week, Tim, it's been a pretty bad week for both the main parties. There's been a big MRP Times poll out, the first since the election, and it shows that Reform are on course to win 270 seats, Labour down to 178, the Tories down just 46. So, who's having a worse week, Keir Starmer or Kemi Badenoch?
Well, I think the simple answer to that question is probably Keir Starmer. He's the Prime Minister. He only 24 hours ago was talking about noises off in his own party over the welfare rebellion. Well, the noises are loud enough now that Downing Street was sticking out press releases at gone midnight, basically explaining that they're going to have to make some changes and back down a bit. So in terms of the sort of raw politics of the week, I think Starmer's having a worse one. But as we've covered in the magazine and as this MRP poll shows, there are a heck of a lot of medium-term jitters in the Conservative Party as well. And I think really the story of this poll is that Nigel Farage has got himself in a position where it's no longer a long shot that he's Prime Minister, and we're somewhere between a possibility and a probability, and that's bad news for both main parties, both of whom have sort of immediate problems and the potential for them to get worse in the months ahead.
Michael, do you agree with that analysis?
I do. So I think that what the poll confirms is that the Conservative Party is in deep difficulties, but it confirms that. So essentially over the last few months, it's been clear that the Conservatives have been eclipsed in the polls by Reform. There's nothing particularly new in this poll about the plight that the Tories face. That's not to diminish the scale of the challenges that they have, which Tim has anatomised in this week's magazine, which inevitably lead to a recurrence of that familiar Tory condition of leadership electionitis, I should say. But for Labour, I think things are more difficult because while, again, there was a falling off in their support in the months after the election because of the winter fuel payment imposition and a sense that Keir Starmer had entered government without a clear governing agenda, things have got worse for Labour in the last week because they face, at the moment, though there is much talk of concession, defeat on the second reading of their flagship welfare bill. There has not been a government defeat at the second reading of a bill since 1986. The signs are, of course, that Labour will cobble together concessions sufficient to ensure that they can get through next Tuesday. But along the way, both the authority of Keir Starmer and his team and also the credibility of Rachel Reeves has taken another blow.
And I think the point there is that, the welfare reforms that they're bringing in will see welfare spending rise. They will not fall. It's just going to rise at a slightly lesser rate. And I think you then get into a situation where, is this a government that's going to be able to do big, serious things and control the finances? Or is it, less than a year in, already in hock to its backbenchers, despite having, an absolutely colossal majority by normal governing standards? And Tony Blair had troubles on welfare early in his tenure, but got through them. It looks a lot less straightforward for Starmer to get through them.
And I think there is a direct impact on the credibility of the Chancellor and the government's economic strategy for the reasons that Tim outlines. So it's perfectly possible, and indeed I share some of the concerns that Labour backbenchers have about the reforms. They were sold initially on the basis of a moral case that reform of welfare was required in order to get people back to work. But when DWP, the department responsible for these reforms, put forward some changes before the autumn statement last time round, the Treasury said, you're not cutting deeply enough. And so the moral case was replaced by a desire on the part of the Treasury to make savings to meet Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules. Fair enough, you might say, but that means that the capacity to inspire or persuade Labour voters that this was all about getting people back into work rather than making savings, that case was damaged. Then you had, at the time of the spending review, an acknowledgement that Labour would go back on the winter fuel payment removal that was deemed necessary last year to meet the fiscal rules. That commitment on the part of Rachel Reeves created an unfunded spending commitment. So it looks as though Rachel Reeves' desire to ensure that she's got control of public finances is unravelling. And that means if the fiscal rules are going to be met, if she's going to have that basic Mr. McCorber arithmetic of income and expenditure meeting, then taxes are going to have to rise in the autumn. And if taxes rise, that means that it's the middle classes who get hit, and that means that there's a further potential for fracture in Labour's governing coalition.
And the irony here is that the attempt to look fiscally responsible and keep spending under control is precisely the thing that now seems likely to lead that to unravel.
Tim, I mean, there's lots of briefing around today, people sticking the knives out and getting sort of Morgan McSweeney, the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, involved, some people blaming the Prime Minister himself. Who's really to blame as a result of this? And if, as it looks likely, there's some concessions and they get the welfare bill, how damaged will Keir Starmer's authority be?
Well, look, I think his authority is pretty damaged. I think there are probably 4 avenues that you look down if you're looking for who's to blame. Certainly some people blame McSweeney, and McSweeney has been regarded as this sort of political strategist on the Labour side for a long time. He was very successful during the general election, less experienced at governing or pushing through policy, and people who would not have dared whisper words against Morgan McSweeney are now beginning to do so. I think criticism is also focused on the Whip's office, where Alan Campbell is an old trooper who I think most people thought was a pretty canny soul, but there seems to have been a loss of communication between the Whips and Number 10 about quite how serious this rebellion was going to be. I think in the building there's a bit of a power struggle going on between McSweeney and Liz Lloyd, who is the person, the ex-Blairite, who's been brought in to kind of push things through and ensure that policy development is better, but also that it gets pushed through. She, as I understand it, is far more militant about sticking to the plans. Morgan, I think, smelling the political coffee and realising that the public and a lot of the parliamentary party are not going to swallow this, I think is more up for having perhaps dismissed the size of the rebellion early. I think is now more up for concessions than Liz Lloyd is. But ultimately, all of this always comes back to the leader. I'm afraid in any British governing situation, the people who are appointed to work for you are your responsibility as Prime Minister. The agenda you set, the drive that you put in place or otherwise, it flows from Starmer. And I think Michael talked about that. The argument that was being made. That, in a sense, that sort of moral argument was one being made to Labour MPs. It wasn't one that the government successfully sold to the public. I don't think. I've spoken to Labour people in the last month who say, well, you could have made a sort of Osborneite argument about supporting people in the workplace and getting out there and doing more on that, and that's not really taken place. But as soon as you start blaming the comms, you're ignoring the basic problem, which is the policy and the leader. And as everybody that you speak to in this government acknowledges, this is not a Prime Minister with a strong sense of what he's trying to do or why he's trying to do it. And from that then flows a lot of things, and it means there's a lack of direction. And frankly, a lot of Labour MPs have a far clearer view of why they got into politics than I think the Prime Minister does, and that's what he's run into here.
I mean, I'm really struck as well that contrast, say, what's been going on with welfare with what the Tories did. You had IDS spending years working with the Centre for Social Justice. You had a whole series of work and policy papers for universal credit, and we all knew the benefits system was going to be out of control post-COVID from 2021, 2022 onwards. It seems remarkable that so little work has been done in preparing the groundwork.
And a lot of Labour people forget the name of their own party. It's supposed to be for working people. It's not supposed to be for people who are not economically active. Yes, Labour always wants to look after the least well off, and any cuts in welfare always hit the least well off. But as you say, Ian Duncan Smith and George Osborne made quite an effective sort of political argument about workers, not shirkers, or however you want to put it. Labour's very neuralgic about going down that path. They haven't sold it to the public, and I don't think their backbenchers have bought any of this either.
I think that's completely right. It was the case that DWP were working on their own model of welfare reform, which was designed to prioritise the means of getting people into work. There are reports from people like Charlie Mayfield, the former sort of John Lewis Supremo, that they were hoping to deploy as part of that case. And you can tell that they, the ministers in DWP, feel that they're being unfairly blamed, because if you listened to David Blunkett on the radio this morning, he name-checked Alison McGovern, Stephen Timms and Liz Kendall, the ministers there, and said it's not their fault. I know from talking to people in the world of Whitehall and the world of welfare that they felt that they were basically mugged by the Treasury, who said, look, enough of this theorising, enough of this fancy policy, just give us the cash. And that's why I think that Tim is right. If there are people who are responsible for the mess, it is Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves. Rachel for, and you can understand the reasons, but for putting savings and those fiscal rules ahead of anything, and Keir Starmer as the top person. The two people who should not be blamed are the Chief Whip and Morgan McSweeney. Don't blame the Chief Whip ever. Any Prime Minister or any Number 10 operation, I used to be Chief Whip.
I was going to say, it's former Chief Whip speaking.
The Chief Whip is looking for trouble. The second thing is, it was the Chief Whip who ensured earlier on that when there were rebels on welfare that they lost the whip. So you can't blame him for any lack of discipline or sensitivity. And then Morgan McSweeney is the architect of the Parliamentary Labour Party, who went out of his way to try to ensure that as many people as possible who were loyalists were put in. The real thing is that if you have loyalists like Meg Hillier, the chair of the Treasury Select Committee, or even the MP for Chesterfield, Toby Perkins, who ran Liz Kendall's leadership campaign, if you have them, then there is no whipping operation. There is no advisor who can win them over. The problem is fundamentally the policy and leadership that the Chancellor and the Prime Minister have provided.
Well, talking of leadership, I mean, you wrote a very stirring defence of Kemi Badenoch last week, talking about how she has, had her judgment vindicated on certain issues. Tim Shipman this week has written for us about the scale of Tory unhappiness, about how things are going currently. Who's right, Michael? Has Tim made you change your mind?
Tim hasn't made me change my mind, but the problem is that I haven't made many other people change their mind. So, I am a Kemi fan. Readers of The Spectator will know that. The thing about The Spectator is that, while that's my view, we have great writers and a great political editor who speak and write as they find. And Tim's reporting this week demonstrates that there is a level of discontent within the Tory family and within the Conservative Parliamentary Party that the leadership has to address. Now, my own view is that some of this worry is premature and misdirected, but that's just my view. Whatever my own personal opinions, you've got to acknowledge, one has to acknowledge, that there is both leadership speculation and widespread criticism.
Tim, what would you find from your reporting this week? What were the kind of top lines?
Look, I think there's several things going on here. There's the whole sort of Tory crisis. The polls are very bad. Kemi's personal ratings are very bad as any leader of the opposition's after 6 months. And the question then arises, what do you do about that? And I think MPs are in various different positions on that. I think some of them are concerned that it's not recoverable before the next election, and that if you went into the local and Welsh elections next year in the same state, that the damage could be so bad that there may be no way back at all. I think there are other people who are more willing to give Kemi Badenoch at least time to address this, and I think I find very few people at the moment who think she should be disposed of before conference. The rules will change. The rules allow for a challenge after November the 2nd. So I think there are two periods. There's November the 2nd up to Christmas, and then there's a period between Christmas, New Year, and those local elections. Those are the sort of two windows of opportunity for the people who think that that things are so bad that she needs to change. So only part of the situation is criticism of her. The question then, if you think things are so bad and you're facing obliteration, the question is, what do you do about it? Does a change of leader make any difference? Does doing things different from how Kemi Badenoch is doing them make a difference? Now, I think some people will look at her public performances and say that someone else could be sharper, could be speak sort of more in the language of the average voter than she does, maybe move slightly quicker and not think that she's got as much time as she's got. But overhanging all of this, as these polls are showing, is the sort of view that Farage is now in pole position to win the next election. And I think part of it is, could Kemi Badenoch make things better in the next 6 months? There's also an issue of people who think ultimately the Conservative Party is going to have to do some form of deal with reform, either before the election or a nods and winks kind of non-aggression pact, or ultimately may have to be offering confidence and supply to a Nigel Farage party that's fallen short. And in that situation, do you need a leader who is more open to that? So it's not just about her performance, it's about her attitude to reform. And I think everybody thinks that Robert Jenrick is more likely to be in a position to do what's needed if that's what they think is what's needed. And, this is not really a kind of ideological left-right thing in the Conservative Party anymore. It's more about what do you think you need to do to survive. So I've spoken to people who think, really we just need to try and cling on to 80 seats and hope that we can then have a say in things. And quite, what you would have once considered home counties moderates are becoming sort of sanguine about the idea that Farage is probably going to be the standard bearer on the right, and that something will have to happen to bring those two together. And a few weeks ago I was writing elsewhere about Cameroons becoming kind of getting used to this idea. Well, David Cameron himself appears to be getting used to the idea. He's met Robert Jenrick, and I don't think David Cameron is backing any kind of coup against Kemi Badenoch, but I think if you asked him honestly, he'd say he expects that she'll be replaced, and he now thinks Robert Jenrick should replace her.
Quite a long journey from that 2014 Newark by-election, which helped save his premiership at a time of UKIP discontent when they were led by Nigel Farage. Michael, that's a really interesting point by Tim, which is that it's not a question of ideology, it's more one of tactics and strategy. What more in terms of tactics and strategy can we do?
Well, I think the in a way I'd push back not against Tim, but against the critics by saying that almost everyone who talks about how things should improve talks in very general terms about a greater degree of energy or improving language or so on. But what I think people miss is, when they say we need more policy, that Kemi has outlined policy on migration, on net zero, on education, on a variety of areas, and there's no one within the Conservative Party, within the broad Conservative family, who said that those policies put forward so far have been misconceived. It's just that they haven't had a hearing, partly because we're still in that period when the long shadow of the last 14 years hangs over the Conservative Party, so it would be difficult for any leader to secure a hearing. People argue she should be more energetic in her opposition to Starmer, well, on grooming gangs and on winter fuel payment, and indeed on the whole question of gender. She's either put manners on or secured a U-turn from Starmer. And then, as you say, there is the whole question of party unity on policy and on direction. And save for the whole question of what the Conservative attitude towards reform should be, as Tim mentions, there's a sort of broad agreement about that, and certainly broad agreement amongst most Conservatives that the key point of distinction between them and reform is that reform's Achilles heel is their fiscal profligacy, and that by the time of the next election, particularly after some of the travails that the government's currently going through that we've talked about, a party that is fiscally responsible will be in a stronger position. So the frustration is real. It's driven, of course, by the powerless position that the Conservatives have in the polls. But to my mind, a lot of the leadership speculation is displacement activity when the Conservative Party should be concentrating on making sure that when we get closer to the election, that they're in a position to do effectively what I don't think either the government or reform will be able to do, which is to have the doctor's mandate required in order to fix Britain. Talking of fixing Britain, James, you had a scoop last night that Munira Mirza, who used to be Boris Johnson's sort of chief policy advisor, has brought together people from Labour, Conservatives and no party in order to create a sort of new, wonk movement to come up with the right ideas. It will be interesting to see whether or not reform itself recognises that its weakness, this lack of policy detail, required to be addressed by working with an organisation like this, or whether actually keeping a small target in policy terms is actually the shrewdest idea for them.
We wait and see. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Tim. And thank you for listening to Coffee House Shots.